today's topic is going to be about the competitive mindset as the most important factor in personal growth, or specifically in competing in esports. And what I mean by competing isn't like being the best player, it's more like just being a below average pro player, which is actually puts you in like the 0.001 percentile of any like esports game when compared to the rest of the pool. And I feel like the biggest factor that decides players that get to that point, which is just below average, doesn't they don't have to be incredible, is their own personal work ethic, their own competitive mindset, their own willpower to be willing to do something that's actually not as enjoyable as people think it is, which is grinding out games, practicing games like 8 to 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for generally, I've seen it take 2 to 3 years for players to break through with that level of practice, assuming you start at ground zero, which is like you just pick up the game. And so this is in response to a bunch of people talking about building up infrastructure in the West. So how important teams are, salaries are, academy teams, like coaching structure, all this, representation, I guess. And there are reasons as to why each of those has a factor in the overall motivation of like an overall player pool, and each of those are important to a certain extent. Obviously, it feels more feasible if you believe you can actually become a pro player and you get paid for it. Like for instance, Glaive, he wasn't really into CS:GO until he realized it was going to become big, and then he put in those like 2 to 3 years of hard work in order to rise back to the top of the scene, and now he leads Astralis, right? So obviously there is some importance to that, but I think the most important part was always going to be your competitive mindset or your willpower. And the reason I believe that's the case is because 99% of the work you're doing is self-motivated. And what I mean by that is like the work you're trying to do is trying to practice, you're trying to get better, you're trying to break down your mistakes, you're trying to find a way to become a better player or to learn the fundamentals and then eventually become a better player. And it is the amount of focus you can put into the game that's what's critical. And you can see this, like there are a bunch of older players who have tried to make a comeback, particularly in like CSGO right now, where they don't ever really do it. And I don't actually think it's because the reflexes are much worse than they were when they were like 10 years younger or whatever. I think the biggest reason is because their focus went to crap. And what I mean by that is because you're older, you have a lot more responsibilities as a person, both to yourself and to your family and to your friends and society or whatever, right? And so it becomes much harder to just focus on one specific goal than when you were younger, which would be like your esports career or your growth as a player. And you have to be willing to and because you're out of the game for so long, you have to be willing to accept the fact that it's going to take 2 to 3 years maybe just to rebuild that, or however long it might take, right? And so that's why I consider like willpower to be the most important. Or I guess another way to put it is I've never seen a player that had incredibly low amounts of self-motivation but was still able to be just a below average player in a pro scene. Like it requires at least an average level of motivation in my experience, not zero. So like you can max out the rest of it. You can get them the money, the infrastructure, the coaching staff, competitive like playing pool to play against, all these different things. And this player with almost no self motivation wouldn't make it. Whereas I've seen players do the exact opposite, where they had none of those things, but they had the self-motivation to improve, the self-motivation to compete, and they broke through. And obviously this is backed by some data. We're talking about a few individuals who have done the latter. And I think it's worth pointing out just because when we're talking about competitive players, they are a minority, and you're not going to get, because when we're talking about competitive players, we're talking about a pool of maybe 100 out of millions of people, and that already puts them into a very specific and very small like group of individuals, so it's hard to measure that scale into the wider area. And obviously, we do have academic journals that have proven that intrinsic motivation is much stronger than extrinsic motivation. So, for instance, if you're self motivated because you like doing your job, you're much more likely to do more better work and more likely to be more motivated than you are if your only interest is getting paid. That's been proven a few times. You can go look it up. So, I'll give you a few examples of like teams or players who have overcome all of this, because I feel like if you hear enough of them, you'll realize like it's not just like an exceptional case. There are multiple exceptional cases, and they do in a way represent the common pro player, because many other pro players have had similar like backstories, or have had maybe they didn't have as rough as circumstances, but they did put in a close to equal amount of hours, most likely. So the first and most obvious example is current SK from CSGO. This is a team that was led by Fallen, and in 2012 or 2013, CS had basically died out because of CGS, and CSGO as a game was pretty bad, from what I remember, or from what I've looked up. And he basically believed that he was going to be an esports player no matter what. He was going to be a CS player no matter what, and he believed it was going to work out. So he came from Brazil, and in Brazil specifically, like the CS like scene had fallen. No pun intended. And what he did was he realized, okay, so there are no leaders in this scene. I will become the leader. And then he became the leader. And then he realized, oh, there's no infrastructure in this scene to teach younger players how to play the game. Well, I'm gonna go build a school and teach them how to play the game. And that's where Games Academy came from. And that's where a bunch of players have since risen up through that system. And when he continued to compete in the local region, and eventually he like played Fur a bunch of times, and then eventually when Fur's team beat him, he got Fur to join his own team to make a slightly better team. And then the two of them, like, they kept grinding, and we're talking about like this is years where like the only opportunity to play internationally was that WSEG, or it might have been WCG back then, some variant of like that global Olympic style esports tournament. And they only had like one chance a year, and it wasn't really working out for them. But MLG did something strange. I think it was 2014, where they ran MLG Aspen X Games, and they had a Brazilian qualifier, and then they were able to win that, and then they were able to play at MLG Aspen, and they shocked the world. They're like, wow, this team is different, like, because they were legit in a way, because they had won like a best of one upset against Cloud9 and Mirage, and then because everybody was excited, they're like, oh man, I can't believe we've never heard of these guys. Maybe we should try to get them more chances. And then they were invited to the major qualifier, and they had no money, so obviously they broke down because they were stuck in the middle of nowhere. And then Fur threatened to leave the team because he, in his own mind, he believed, if we can't even play in the major, what the hell was the point of all of this? And because like this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity for everybody there, so they decided to run a stream, and like all the fans chipped in. Flusha famously put in $4,000, and then they flew over, got that major qualifier spot, got into the major, and then from there they kept parlaying into bigger and better things over time, constantly, over and over again. Right, that's like the SK origin story, and it is one of the it is the literal like pull yourself from the bootstraps type shit, basically, where they came from nothing and now they're the best team in the world. And not only are they the best team in the world, they're actually going out of their way to help their own region and others, and in a way try to like raise up their game, try to improve locally, because that's just who they are as people, I guess. So that's just one example, and obviously it's like a humongous one, but I'll give you another one. Infiltration from Street Fighter. This is a Korean player, and unlike StarCraft, Brood War, League of Legends, even Overwatch, there was no Street Fighter scene at all to in Korea. Like at least in StarCraft 2, they had a bunch of like players who had either failed Brood War or like they saw they or like they played the game when they were really young and they decided to play it for a little bit. But like in StarCraft 2, the talent pool is always incredibly small for in Korea relative to Brood War or League of Legends, right? And it was way smaller for Street Fighter than was for the other games, where it's literally just like infiltration and Punko and a few other guys. And even then, like infiltration didn't know any of them, and they didn't know him because he was just a video game like store clerk, and he decided one day he was going to become a Street Fighter player. That's actually how the story goes. And so what he did was in order to practice, because back then the only way to practice back then was to go to an arcade, play in your locals, and then because you're such a noob, the guys in the locals who are veterans, they'll teach you like tricks of the trade, and then you get better. And then once you get good in your locals, you go to the next level, which is like the nationals, and then the next level, which is the internationals. That's how it works in America. That's kind of how it works in Japan. But this only works if you actually have a scene, and Korea didn't have a scene, and they didn't even have a chance to fly abroad most of the time. And so the other choice that's more common nowadays is to play online, and then you just play a bunch of games online. And that's kind of how you grind out. That's kind of how you learn. In Infiltration's case, though, he had neither of those choices. What he did was he went into the practice room, like literally the 1v1 against like AI, because the AI isn't moving. All it does is just show you the combo strings and how much damage you do, and you can kind of set up the AI so you can practice. And that's what Infiltration did. He went into the AI room, he practiced over and over and over again to get, and then he theory crafted how he was going to beat a bunch of these players. He would watch their games, he'd shadowbox them in his mind. He'd be like, okay, so these are his tendencies. This is what he does. This is what he does in this situation. This is what he does in this situation. This is how I'm going to counter this. This is how, if I use these tools, I negate each of these like different options that he has, right? And that's why when he eventually busted out, and he was such a shock because he was so fundamentally sound for a player that had never played anywhere. Nobody even knew him. Even when he rose to the top, the Korean players like, yeah, we don't know shit about this guy. Like he literally plays by himself in a room. Like he plays 8 hours in that fucking practice room by himself, and he kind of revolutionized the way people thought about studying Street Fighter, because he was the first guy to have like kind of like a coach laugh. But obviously like it's a bit suspect as to how important laugh eventually was, because that partnership kind of split up, and Infiltration still is like a fucking god, whereas like laugh is nowhere. And he was also the guy who would bring notes, and everybody thought, oh man, this is such bullshit. But after he like brought it in, everyone realized, wow, this is like game changing shit. Because if you have like notes of your next opponent, of how they play, you have like a mental edge when you go into the match. And then kind of ironically, Infiltration kind of stopped using it. I'm gonna guess it's mostly because of the way his style changed, and because he had seen so much, like he didn't need the notes to recall how a bunch of these players were playing. I guess that's the way I think it changed. And so he's like an example of a guy who literally had less than nothing also, but rose to the top of Street Fighter and is still one of the best players in the world. Most recently winning Evo Japan over Daigo and John Takeuchi. All right. Another case from Korea is the MVP team in Dota 2. And Dota 2 is equally as desolate compared in the Street Fighter scene, I believe. Basically, there's only 10 guys and then that were playing in Dota 2 at the time. And a bunch of them were like people who had come from America or like come from Australia, as far as I know. So they were just playing it. So they were just playing in Korea. They didn't have any servers. They didn't have. The only team they had was MVP, and like MVP is like a much smaller team, so I doubt they would get paid a lot. All they would have is like the basic discipline of a Korean team. And to point out, MVP isn't really a true Kespa team. It's a team that was built off of StarCraft 2, and it's one of the only surviving teams for multiple reasons. But it's not a truly professional, like well paid organization, even though they have made something like crazy good for themselves. Like per capita, they're probably the most successful team I've ever seen, but that's like a different topic. And so basically, what these guys had to do was they had to grind out. They had to grind out against each other, and then they formed a super Korean team. And then instead of stunning people like infiltration, they kind of just honed in on a specific style that's famously now known as caveman style, where they just kept running into motherfuckers over and over and over and over again, and it was fucking aggressive. It was fucking crazy. It was amazing to watch, and they and it's not like they became the best team in the world, but they were a super dark horse because that kind of style is very hard to deal with, and they had made a hell of a run to TI. I think it was top 6, and they did win a tournament against some of the better teams. So that's actually amazing. Obviously, if you go back further into Korea's past, you have like the the old Korean teams with Solo, who actually did something very similar to that, where they'd have, I believe it was CJ Entis, and might have been Lunatic High. I forget the organization, but basically what they had to do was, because nobody played Counter-Strike in Korea, they would split up the server like 2v3 or 3v2, and then practice like defending bomb sites. Then they do theoretical shit like, okay, we're just going to go into this server and then we're going to dry run a bunch of our strats over and over and over again, because that's the only thing we can do. That's all we can do. And they became a legitimate team in CS 1.6. Right? And there's like a bunch of other examples. Kane Blue River in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is one, where it's like he didn't come from America, but he eventually became EVO champion. And he also didn't have like any kind of local scene to like go up through. He didn't really have a team, didn't really have a salary, but he grinded a shitload. He bummed his way from like house to house, like traveling constantly, and then he eventually rose to the top and took that fucking EVO, despite like apparently nobody in Marvel was happy about that, but he did it. He won, right? And I just point there are other examples I could bring up, but I think you get my point, where like there are multiple examples of incredible players who have come up from nothing, who have beaten the odds, so to speak, and the biggest factor was because of their competitive mindset, of their willpower, of what they wanted to do, of their unwillingness to like let these obstacles stop them. And I've never really heard of the reverse. I've never really heard of a player who didn't have some modicum of motivation, some modicum of discipline, and they somehow still made it because of all the other things. And that's kind of why I consider the mindset, the willpower, to be the limiting force. And I'll end this with like a quote from Daigo Umehara, where he kind of tries to explain this mindset, where he basically says this: would you still want the same thing if you were born 30 years earlier? There's actually a system in place for pro gaming now, but what if there wasn't? If you couldn't go pro and would never be famous, would you still be able to pour yourself into games? The ones that are resolute in spite of that have the disposition to be happy with their choice and won't be swayed by bad results. And that's from his book, The Will to Keep Winning. And the point of that quote is basically it has to come from within. Like, even though you can make a living being a programmer now, even though there are better systems, better structures in place in order to get there, in order to teach you how to play the game, to truly compete, to go through all those mindless hours of grinding and practicing, all that hard work, you have to have something within you, and that is the most important factor. That is the competitive mindset. That is what will drag you through everything. All right, see you later.